"The trouble with Mondays," said Lord Peter Wimsey, flicking a fleck of imaginary ash from his perfectly ironed cuff, "is that one never knows whether one is suffering from existential dread or merely overboiled eggs." He had made this remark in the drawing-room of the Dower House at Ellingham-le-Briars, a village so aggressively picturesque it seemed to have been landscaped by a sentimental novelist and populated by actors on loan from a 1923 edition of Country Life. The conversation, such as it was, concerned the curious case of Mr. Wallace Peveril, who had by all accounts done nothing at all on the morning of Monday, the 17th of April. "He just sat there," repeated Miss Camilla Branksome, who held the dual positions of local historian and ecclesiastical busybody, "under that wretched yew by the church gate, in the same spot for nearly 3 hours, from the striking of the church bell at 9 until just before midday prayers. Not a twitch, not a blink. Quite dead, of course, though I dare say he had looked worse alive." Wimsey raised one brow, reached for a second cup of coffee, which, though tepid, was improved by a medicinal tot of brandy, and considered the corpse in question. Wallace Peveril was, or had been, an unsuccessful antiquarian, a professed expert in medieval funerary brasses, and an occasional correspondent for the Illustrated Tombstone. He resided in the crumbling half of a divided manor house, known locally as Peveril's Folly, and appeared to have spent the better part of the last decade arguing with anyone who challenged his theories about the ceremonial positioning of 14th-century effigies. Well, Wimsey said lightly, if one must perish, one could do worse than in a state of devotional paralysis beside a 13th-century chapel. Had he at least the decency to expire discreetly? "He looked," replied Miss Branksome primly, "as though he were waiting for someone, very quietly, hat in lap, one hand on his cane, eyes rather well open." At this the local constabulary, represented by Inspector Willoughby, whose moustache alone could have conducted an inquiry, coughed politely and entered with the solemn dignity of one bringing news unfit for tea-tables. "Post-mortem came back," he muttered. "No signs of trauma. Heart stopped. Might have been natural. Except, well, you saw his shoes, didn't you?" Wimsey, whose tastes ran to suede spats and mischief, looked intrigued. "I rather thought they were new. Brand new. No scuffs. But the soles, clean as a whistle. Not a speck of gravel or moss. He was sitting on a bench that hasn't been swept in a fortnight, right under that mouldy yew. But not a mark. No mud. No yewberries. Not even a leaf." Wimsey set down his cup, which now seemed unnecessarily frivolous. "So, he didn't walk there," he murmured. "How very inconvenient of him." Willoughby's moustache twitched. "Unless someone placed him there." "A decorative corpse," said Wimsey, rising and retrieving his hat with mock solemnity. "Very modernist. I once saw something similar at a gallery in Montparnasse, but it involved more feathers and an alarming amount of green paint. Shall we inspect the bench?" And thus, with only a few sardonic pleasantries and a quick examination of the village map, chapel, vicarage, tea-shop, lich-gate, yes, the graveyard, predictably Gothic, Lord Peter Wimsey stepped into the Monday mystery of Wallace Peveril, a man who, by all appearances, had been precisely where he should not have been, looking altogether too serene for a man recently deceased, and, as Lord Peter was wont to say, when a corpse is found behaving too properly, one must suspect a most improper arrangement. Lord Peter Wimsey regarded the churchyard bench with the vaguely scholarly interest he might reserve for a Roman ruin or a questionable 17th-century wine. The yew tree loomed beside it, shaggy and damp, casting a greenish shadow across the gravel path. He crouched, gently, so as not to distress his trousers, and passed a finger along the stone slab that served as the seat. It came away with a faint smear of mossy grime. "Well," he murmured to Inspector Willoughby, who stood at his shoulder like a solicitous but rather suspicious butler, "either our Mr. Peveril spent his final hours levitating, or someone gave the man a lift." Willoughby shifted uncomfortably. "We've no reports of anyone seeing a car. It's a quiet lane, no through road, and the chapel bell would have been ringing just before 9. If he were dropped off, you'd think someone would have noticed. A thoroughly English village, Inspector. Inhabitants half blind to scandal and wholly deaf to engines. Until, of course, it concerns someone's aunt's laundry or the choir mistress's cousin's lodger. He stood, brushing his fingers delicately. I believe it's time we met the domestic contingent. I've long believed that a butler knows nothing and says everything, while a housekeeper says nothing and knows the lot. Peveril's home, Peveril's folly, was the sort of house that had once aspired to be a minor manor and had instead become an architectural afterthought. The front facade wore a scowl of ivy, and the interior smelt of camphor, dead bees, and thwarted ambition. The housekeeper, Mrs. Arglass, was of a type Whimsy immediately recognized: iron spine, damp eyes, and a faint odor of onions. She received them in the tiled front hall beneath a portrait of a man who looked as though he had died attempting to complete a sonnet while constipated. Mr. Peveril was a private gentleman, she said firmly, as though any suggestion otherwise would constitute moral treason. Lived mostly in his library, never went out Mondays, not unless it were to lecture the Historical Society in Winchcombe, and that only once a quarter. Then I gather his Monday morning stroll to the chapel gate was out of character. Mrs. Ardglass pursed her lips. Entirely. My lord, he hated the church, called it neo-pagan claptrap wrapped in flint. Begged my pardon afterward, mind you. Said it was the gout talking. Whimsy, who suspected gout spoke with a more colourful vocabulary, made a note. And yet he was found at its very doorstep, all devotion and composure. Did he receive any visitors Sunday evening? There was the usual post, she allowed, but nothing personal, just a package from Malthus and Elder, his bookseller in Bath, and a note, I think, though he burnt it in the study fire not 10 minutes after reading. I saw the corner, heavy cream paper. No mark on it. Suspiciously blank, was it? No. No writing on it. Just no address, as though someone had slipped it through the door. Whimsy's eyebrows rose. And this was after the house was locked for the night. She hesitated. Well, not quite. Mr. Peveril often sat up till midnight, reading, talking to himself, scribbling on envelopes. But no visitors. I'd have heard them. I sleep in the east wing, above the vestibule. Willoughby cleared his throat. Nothing. A disturbed? No signs of a break-in? Not so much as a draught, she said, proud of her stewardship. Whimsy gave a small nod, turning to the sideboard where a collection of antique keys lay in a dish shaped like a Roman oil lamp. He picked one up, examined it. He was rather obsessive, wasn't he? Thorough, she said with dignity. Ah, yes, thoroughness, the English disease. He smiled, setting the key back with a clink. And this envelope he burnt did. You happened to note his expression when he read it. Her eyes, until now opaque with domestic rectitude, flickered. Oddly pleased, she admitted, as though something had come round at last. Hope, Whimsy said softly, is always fatal in a Golden Age mystery. Thank you, Mrs. Arglass, you've been perfectly opaque. They took their leave, passing the cluttered drawing-room where a half-finished model of Gloucester Cathedral stood beside a pile of backdated journals. On the mantelpiece, a solitary glove, suede, left-handed, lay folded with ceremonial neatness. Whimsy paused. Did Peveril suffer from the singular affliction of one cold hand? He asked, glancing back at the housekeeper. He had the pair when I dusted in the morning, she said, eyes narrowing. Perhaps the others in his coat. Pocket, perhaps, Whimsy murmured, unconvinced. Back outside, the village air was brisk with late April chill and the faint scent of cattle. They turned toward the chapel, where a man with narrow shoulders and a soft black hat stood polishing the ancient hinges of the lich gate. This, it turned out, was Mr. Tobias Blench, sexton and amateur dramatist, who greeted them with a suspiciously poetic turn of phrase. The dead man, you say? Quiet as frost, sat there like he'd seen a ghost, or meant to become one. Whimsy smiled indulgently. Mr. Blench, we're not quite at the supernatural chapter yet. Tell me, had you seen Mr. Peveril here before, perhaps sketching, or consulting with the vicar? Blench shook his head. Not on Mondays. Never seen him. At all, truth told. But I did hear something strange the night before. About 11, I'd say. Heard the church bell, just the one clang, odd that. I'd locked up myself at 6. Willoughby looked sharply at him. Could have been a gust of wind. Blench's mouth twisted. Not with that bell, sir. It'd take a man's arm and some nerve. Whimsy considered this. Did you mention it to the vicar? The vicar, Reverend Trevis, was a gaunt man with the look of someone trying very hard not to think about theology. He greeted them in the vestry with a mix of nervous civility and visible unease. I wasn't told about the bell," he admitted, "though I did find the east door ajar that morning. I assumed Blench had left it unsecured. Entirely unlike me," muttered the sexton. "Indeed," said Wimsey softly. "A man like Mr. Peveril, not prone to devotions, receives a mysterious letter, burns it, and the next morning he's seated, posthumously, on a bench beside a locked chapel whose bell rang when it oughtn't. Tell me, Reverend, was anything missing from the sanctuary?" Trevis looked startled. "Nothing that I noticed. And yet you noticed the door was ajar." "Yes, well, the wind, I assumed." "People assume many things on Mondays," said Wimsey. "The beginning of the week lends itself to errors." He turned to Willoughby, his tone suddenly light. "I wonder, what if our late antiquarian had a reason to die in that spot? A private ritual or a public performance?" "You think he staged it?" Willoughby looked sceptical. "Not at all. I think someone else staged it for him. They left the vicar visibly unsettled, and the sexton muttering to his latchkey. As they returned along the path, Wimsey's gaze lingered on the lich gate. A long smear of blackened pollen marked the stone just beneath it, a dragging mark oddly straight. "Someone carried him here," Wimsey said at last, voice low, "and wiped their tracks very carefully. But they forgot that the U has a signature." Willoughby frowned. "So the murder took place elsewhere?" Wimsey nodded. "That, or our Mr. Peveril sat willingly, somewhere else entirely, until someone decided he'd sat long enough." The wind rustled the chapel leaves, and a bell somewhere in the house behind them gave a faint accidental chime. "Time," said Wimsey, "has begun to misbehave." And in the drawing-room of Peveril's Folly, the single left glove still lay on the mantelpiece, a quiet witness no one had quite explained. By the following morning the mist had crept up from the river like an elderly housemaid with a tray of regrets, and Lord Peter Wimsey stood once more in the parlour of Peveril's Folly, contemplating the glove. It was a small thing, left-handed, finely made of grey suede, with tiny mother-of-pearl buttons that hinted at a feminine origin. Certainly not Peveril's, whose hands had been blunt, scholarly things that smelled faintly of dust and zinc polish. Wimsey reached out, delicately lifted the glove between thumb and forefinger, and examined the lining. It was faintly scented. Bergamot, perhaps, or some subtle cologne, not new but lingering. And stitched into the lining, nearly invisible unless one knew where to look, were two embroidered initials. J.M. "Well," Wimsey said, turning it like a conundrum, "either Mr. Peveril had acquired a habit of borrowing gloves from mysterious women, or someone left this behind in a hurry." He tucked the glove into his coat and descended to the library, where Mrs. Arglass had laid out a pot of rather militant tea and a small plate of shortbread biscuits that looked as though they disapproved of being eaten. The housekeeper, standing nearby with arms folded and mouth tight, watched him with the careful suspicion of someone whose employer had died inconveniently on her day off. "I suppose," Wimsey said casually, "Mr. Peveril never entertained female callers." She sniffed. "Not in the formal sense, certainly not to tea." "Informally, then?" "There was a Miss Malvern," she said, after a pause too short to be honest. "She came about once a fortnight, said she was helping him catalogue old family papers. I didn't see much use in it." "There's nothing in this house worth cataloguing except mildew." "Miss Malvern," Wimsey repeated. "Young, 30-ish, I'd say. Not pretty, but she knew how to speak, didn't titter. Always wore gloves." Wimsey looked faintly amused. "Always?" "Always, even indoors. I thought it odd, but she said she had a skin complaint, the kind one doesn't ask about." "And she came last. When?" "Friday. 2 days before he died." The doorbell rang, a brittle Baroque thing that sounded like a spider being shaken in a teacup, and Mrs. Ardglass left to answer it. Wimsey crossed to the writing desk and examined the blotter. Peveril had been a hard, pressing writer. His loops and underlines scarred the paper like plough lines. Among the illegible quotations and references to de Vere of Altbrass' controversial shading was a more recent impression. J.M., no more delay, Monday. When Mrs. Ardglass returned, she wore the resigned expression of someone reluctantly admitting trouble through the front door. "There's a lady," she said, as though it were a category of problem. "Asking for Mr. Peveril. She didn't know about his condition." Wimsey rose, brushing imaginary lint from his lapel. "Let us not disappoint her." The woman in the vestibule was tall, composed, and undeniably striking in that rather austere way possessed by late Edwardian governesses and certain minor deities. She wore a tailored coat the colour of gunmetal, a black cloche hat, and, of course, gloves, pale grey, matching, and both present. "Miss Malvern, I presume?" Wimsey inquired, bowing slightly. Her gaze was steady. "You presume correctly." "Lord Peter Wimsey," he said, "a private inquirer. I'm assisting the authorities with Mr. Peveril's rather sedentary departure." She said nothing to this, but her lips pressed together in the shape of a question she did not intend to voice. Instead, she removed one glove with slow deliberation, revealing slender fingers and a curious silver ring in the shape of a knot. "I heard nothing," she said finally. "No one informed me. I take it you were close. We had an understanding, intellectual, collaborative. Wallace was not easy to like, but he was dedicated. The only man I've met who could quote Gesta Regum Anglorum while forgetting his own birthday." "Sounds romantic," said Wimsey dryly. "Might I ask where you were on Monday morning?" "Cheltenham," she replied without hesitation. "Cataloguing a donation at the Spa Museum. I left Saturday afternoon, returned last night." "Anyone who might confirm that?" "The director, Mr. Ricks, and 3 volunteers. I spent most of Monday elbow-deep in Edwardian paperweights." Wimsey gave a polite smile. "How industrious. And yet Mr. Peveril's housekeeper claims you visited on Friday." "I did. He showed me a document, an early transcript of a family will. Faded ink, but the date stood out. April 17th, 1325. "The same day as his death," murmured Wimsey. Her eyes narrowed slightly. "I don't deal in portents, Lord Peter." "No," he agreed, "but you do wear gloves." She lifted her chin. "I have a skin condition." "Of course, but you left one behind. Or someone with the same initials did." At that, her composure cracked, only slightly, but enough. Her eyes flicked down, then back up. "I don't recall doing so." "No," said Wimsey. "I rather think you wouldn't." He led her to the study, gesturing for her to sit. She refused, standing like a statue carved for a particularly unwelcoming tomb. "This transcript, do you know what it implied?" "Only what he told me, that the Peveril line had a secret branch, a bastard child, disinherited under Edward. Tus, he believed it explained a missing monument in the south transept." Wimsey tapped the edge of the desk. "He found something, didn't he? Not just theory, something inconvenient, something that might change how people see the Peveril name." She didn't answer. He walked to the hearth, knelt, and stirred the ash with the fire tongs. Amid the grey remains of a letter was a small clasp, metal, tarnished, broken. "A jewellery fastener," he said. "Possibly from a glove or a necklace, burnt, destroyed. Rather odd for a man so devoted to preserving the past." Miss Malvern stepped forward, just once. "He received a message. He didn't say from whom. But he was elated. He said it was time to sit and wait, that it would all come clear." Wimsey stood. "And so he sat but never got up." She turned away toward the window. "You think I know more?" "I think," said Wimsey softly, "that you've known too much. Too long. About the will, about the heir, about someone who didn't want the story known." She said nothing, but her silence was no longer opaque. Outside, the clouds had thickened, and the chapel bell, disturbed by a wind not entirely natural, gave a single uncertain clang. Someone else had known about the document, someone who needed Peveril's silence, and someone had moved a corpse to sit quite politely in the wrong place at precisely the wrong time. But who? The village of Winchcombe had an unhurried, measured air that belied the undercurrents now stirring beneath its prim facades. Lord Peter Wimsey, with the careful steps of a man tracing faint echoes, returned to the scene of his earlier ruminations, the chapel and its peculiar gate where the corpse had been found seated. Inspector Willoughby accompanied him, carrying a small notebook and a look that oscillated between mild exasperation and genuine curiosity. "I still can't quite grasp why you insist on this bench." he confessed as they crossed the gravel path once more, when all signs suggest Peveril died elsewhere. Wimsey gave a faint smile, the kind that suggested patience as much as amusement. Because, my dear Inspector, it is precisely the displacement that is the key. The scene is a message, not merely a tableau. The morning light slanted through the yew branches, casting a latticework of shadow that played tricks on the eyes. Wimsey crouched again beside the bench, fingers lightly tracing the faint smudges and scratches on the stone. He looked upwards to the chapel door, still slightly ajar, as Reverend Trevis appeared at the threshold. "Morning, my lord," said the vicar with a thin smile, the tremor of unease still lurking behind his polite tone. "I trust your investigations progress well." "As well as one might expect when one is dealing with the enigmatic tendencies of the departed," Wimsey replied. "Might I trouble you for the keys to the church interior? I wish to examine the sanctum more closely." Trevis hesitated, a flicker of reluctance crossing his features. "Certainly, though I confess the matter weighs on my spirits. This house of God being touched by such sordid affairs is a sorrow indeed." Wimsey inclined his head respectfully. "Sorrow, yes, but also illumination. A chapel with secrets, like a book with blank pages, both demanding to be read." The vicar produced a small iron key, its bow worn and tarnished, and handed it over with a grave nod. Together they stepped inside. The church was modest, the walls adorned with faded murals that told biblical stories in peeling pastel, the wooden pews polished, but showing the wear of decades. Wimsey's keen eyes swept over the interior, noting the subtle dust patterns, the angle of light through stained glass, the faint scent of beeswax and damp stone. He approached the south transept, the very place Miss Malvern had mentioned, where the alleged missing monument should have stood. Kneeling, he ran his fingers along the floorboards beneath the window and found a small square patch of newer wood. Curious, he mused. A repair, or perhaps a deliberate covering. Reverend Trevis shuffled closer. "I was unaware of any restoration here." Wimsey stood abruptly, eyes narrowing. "You were aware of something. The absence of the monument is a peculiarity, yes? It is as though the church itself has been asked to forget." At that moment, Willoughby's voice broke the reverie. "Lord Peter, I found something near the altar." He held out a folded piece of paper, yellowed and fragile. Wimsey took it carefully, unfolding what appeared to be a church inventory list dated 19 years earlier. Among the entries, a single name had been scratched out: Peveril Memorial, South Transept. Someone erased Peveril's mark. "From the book," Wimsey observed, "as though denying the family's claim to this sanctuary." Reverend Trevis swallowed hard. "I confess there was some disagreement years ago, a dispute over funds and inheritance. The Peveril estate withheld donations until the monument was erected. When it never appeared, the parish committee moved on." "But the money?" Wimsey asked, eyes gleaming with the promise of a puzzle. "Returned," Trevis answered quickly. "Or so I was told." Wimsey smiled thinly. "Or so you were told, yes. And the missing will Miss Malvern spoke of may hold the key." The vicar's hand trembled as he placed a candle back on the shelf. "I fear this line of inquiry may open old wounds best left to heal." Wimsey's gaze was unyielding. "Wounds can fester when ignored, Reverend." Their conversation was interrupted by a sharp rap at the door. The parish clerk entered, breathless and holding a bundle of papers. "Apologies for the intrusion, gentlemen. I thought you'd like to see these." He handed over a small packet of correspondence. Letters addressed to Mr. Peveril from various local residents, all concerned with the upcoming Historical Society meeting, but one in particular stood out. It was an unsigned note, dated the day before the murder. "The past must remain buried. The truth will unsettle more than stones. Be cautious where you sit." Wimsey held the letter up to the light, noting the absence of a return address and the deliberate ambiguity of the script. "A threat, then?" Willoughby folded his arms. "And rather direct?" "Indeed," Wimsey agreed, "yet curiously polite, like a poison in a cup of tea." He paused, fingers tapping the letter. "Now consider this. If Peveril was warned and yet chose to sit, to await something, was he expecting company, or planning a confrontation?" Reverend Trevis looked away. He was an obstinate man, Lord Peter. I doubt he would be intimidated. Obstinacy is the cloak of many secrets, Wimsey said softly, and secrets breed enemies. Their return to Peveril's Folly was accompanied by a gathering of clouds that thickened with portent. Back inside, the air was heavier, the silence, punctuated only by the faint tick of an ornate grandfather clock in the hall. Wimsey's eyes were drawn once more to the mantelpiece where the solitary left glove still lay. He reached out and picked it up, weighing it as if it were a clue in itself. "I propose," he said, "that this glove is a talisman, a token of trust, or perhaps a symbol of complicity." Mrs. Arglass, summoned once more, watched with a wary expression as Wimsey turned over the glove in his hands. "Do you recognize this glove?" he inquired. She hesitated. "I don't. I mean, I've seen Miss Malvern wear gloves, but not this one specifically." Wimsey nodded. "And yet, the embroidery, J.M., is unmistakable," Mrs. Arglass sighed. "I suppose it must be hers, then, and you have no idea why it would be left behind. I'm only the housekeeper, my lord. I see what I see, but sometimes I wonder if seeing is a curse." Wimsey smiled, but there was no mockery in it. "Sometimes it is, Mrs. Ardglass." As evening fell, Wimsey requested a review of Peveril's correspondence and diaries. The pages were yellowed and dense with scholarly notes, but one entry caught his eye, dated the Friday before the death. "Received document. Medieval will transcript. Notes possible secret heir. Must confirm lineage before Monday meeting. Risk high." His finger lingered on the words, "risk high." Something in the phrasing spoke of urgency, not merely scholarly, but personal. Wimsey looked up at Willoughby. "Our Mr. Peveril was not merely a man who sat on a Monday, Inspector. He was a man who sat on the edge of revelation, and fell." Willoughby nodded grimly. "So who would stand to lose by that revelation?" Now," Wimsey said, tapping the diary closed. "That is precisely the question we must answer, before the clock strikes the next hour." Outside, the village lamps flickered on, their light catching the faint outline of a figure retreating into the shadows near the churchyard gate. Wimsey's eyes followed it. The game, as they say, was afoot. That night, the wind swept down from the Cotswold hills with an unseasonal sharpness, rattling the ancient leaded windows of Peveril's Folly, as though eager to unsettle the dust of buried secrets. Lord Peter Wimsey sat by the study fire, the embers glowing faintly against the heavy curtains drawn tight against the autumn chill. His thoughts, like the shadows dancing upon the walls, flickered between the enigmatic figures he had met and the cryptic fragments of the case, gloves, wills, and a man who had chosen to sit on a Monday awaiting his fate. Inspector Willoughby paced the length of the room, muttering observations into the space like a man wrestling with the logic of the impossible. "We have threats, a vanished monument, missing documents, and a glove belonging to Miss Malvern, but nothing that conclusively ties anyone to the act." "True," Wimsey replied, lighting a cigar with a deliberate flourish. "Yet the devil resides in the details, and I believe our devil is a man or woman, quite adept at misdirection." Willoughby stopped, his hands behind his back. "You mentioned earlier that the bench was a message, a clue even. But why the bench? Why seat the body in that specific place?" Wimsey exhaled a thin plume of smoke, watching it curl toward the ceiling. "Because the bench faces the village, the churchyard, and the chapel door. 3 symbolic points. The seat itself is worn unevenly on one side, suggesting habitual use." "Habitual use by Peveril?" asked Willoughby. "Or by someone else? Someone who wished to send a signal. Consider this. Peveril's last entry about sitting and waiting, a phrase loaded with double meaning. It is quite likely he intended to meet someone here. And that meeting turned fatal." "Exactly so. But why move his body from the place of death to the bench, to create a tableau, to delay discovery, or to implicate?" The inspector frowned. "Implicate whom?" Wimsey smiled faintly. "That is the puzzle. But first, I suggest we test the timeline, step by step." Together they reviewed the known facts. Peveril's last confirmed presence inside the Folly on Friday afternoon, Miss Malvern's alibi in Cheltenham on Monday, the unsigned warning letter, and the chapel's peculiar history. "We know," Wimsey continued, That Miss Malvern visited on Friday. She left the glove behind, or so we suspect, but she claims to have been away on Monday. Willoughby nodded. Checked with the Spa Museum. The director and volunteers confirm she was there. And yet, Wimsey mused, someone delivered a letter on Monday threatening silence. An unsigned letter, the inspector repeated. No handwriting match with the household or Miss Malvern's known correspondences? Precisely. Which implies a third party, someone who knows the manuscript's value and fears exposure. Willoughby drummed his fingers on the desk. What? Of the other Peveril relatives, the nephew, the wife? The nephew, Lord Geoffrey Peveril, is a spendthrift of modest intellect, but significant arrogance. His alibi is thin but unconvincing. A late-night poker game at the village pub, corroborated only by himself and a rather tipsy landlord. Motivation enough, said Willoughby. Certainly financial. He stood to lose a considerable allowance. If the secret heir surfaced, as Peveril's will would presumably favour the legitimate line. And the wife? Margaret Peveril is a woman of considerable social grace and secretive habits. She claims to have been in London over the weekend, attending an exhibition opening. Wimsey arched an eyebrow. Alone? No one to confirm. An absence, then, that invites scrutiny. They agreed that both figures merited further investigation, but that the web was more tangled than a mere financial dispute. Wimsey rose, stretching languidly. There is another matter. The clocks. Willoughby blinked. The clocks? Yes, this house, like many of its kind, boasts several timekeepers. The grandfather clock in the hall, a carriage clock on the mantel, and a curious assortment of watches belonging to the family and staff. I have noticed discrepancies. The inspector's brow furrowed. Discrepancies? Indeed. The hall clock was 2 minutes slow, according to Mrs. Ardglass, who resets it every Sunday. Yet the carriage clock was fast by 3 minutes. The watches varied unpredictably. Why would that matter? Wimsey smiled, eyes twinkling. Because time, Inspector, is the silent accomplice of murder. A murderer must account for it, or be undone by it. They examined the clocks, noting that the hall clock's pendulum was slightly askew, causing a slow tick, while the carriage clock had a faint, almost imperceptible adjustment, screw loose. Sabotage, declared Wimsey. To confuse or to create an alibi. Willoughby was silent for a moment. So the timeline of Peveril's last movements may have been deliberately obscured. Exactly. Consider this. If the clocks show inconsistent times, statements anchored to them may be false. Who benefits from confusion over time? The inspector nodded slowly. The person who wants to be elsewhere, but appear here. Wimsey pursed his lips thoughtfully. And someone with access to the house, to the clocks, and to Peveril's habits. Mrs. Ardglass's name hung unspoken in the air, but Wimsey chose a more delicate approach. He summoned the housekeeper for questioning once more, this time with a touch more candor. Mrs. Ardglass, you said you reset the hall clock every Sunday. When was the last time before the death? Last Sunday, my lord. Before that, 2 weeks prior. I'm not one for fiddling with machinery. And the carriage clock? Mr. Peveril's, I believe. It's kept in the library. I don't touch it. Yet it was fast by 3 minutes on Monday morning. Mrs. Ardglass hesitated, eyes narrowing. I don't know, my lord. Perhaps someone else adjusted it. Precisely. Who has the opportunity? Only the household and Miss Malvern when she visits. Wimsey nodded thoughtfully. Opportunity. Narrows. Now what of the servants' testimonies? The butler, Mr. Quinn, was next. A tall, austere man with a slight limp and a face carved from stone. His alibi was flawless. He was in the kitchen overseeing the evening meal, witnessed by the cook and 2 kitchen maids. Yet Wimsey noticed the subtle twitch at the corner of his mouth when questioned about the time of Peveril's last movement. How certain are you of your watch's accuracy, Mr. Quinn? Quinn's expression tightened. I do not concern myself with trifles such as seconds, my lord. Trifles are often the bedfellows of murder, Wimsey remarked mildly. Turning his attention to the village, Wimsey spent the afternoon walking the lanes between Peveril's Folly and Cheltenham, timing the journey and noting the state of the roads, the quiet presence of the river, and the position of the sun. The distance was just enough that a journey by car could be made in under an hour, assuming no mechanical difficulties, which brought him to another point. The family car, a rather battered but serviceable Austin 7, had a fresh scratch on its rear fender, one not recorded in the logbook. He queried the chauffeur, Mr. Peters, a wiry man with a nervous twitch. Peters claimed ignorance of any incident. A scratch does not merely appear overnight, Whimsy observed. Was the car used on Monday? Only for the mail run, my lord. I left at 8 a.m., returned by 9. Alone? Yes. The letters from the local post office were intact, and the clerk confirmed the arrival and dispatch times. No one else was scheduled to use the vehicle, yet Whimsy had discovered a faint trace of dirt on the rear wheel, a telltale sign that the car had veered off the road onto soft earth recently. It seems our mail run was rather adventurous, he murmured. With these threads in hand, Whimsy returned to the folly as dusk fell. The house had settled into its nightly silence, broken only by the distant hoot of an owl and the tick of misaligned clocks. In the dim light of the study, he gathered his thoughts, sifting the clues as a jeweler examines a raw diamond. The glove, with its mysterious initials, the missing monument and disputed will, the errant clocks, the scratched car, and the unsatisfactory alibis. His mind lingered longest on Miss Malvern. Her aloofness, her reticence, and the unanswered question of why she would come here so often, wearing gloves and guarding secrets as tightly as a miser his gold. Yet the missing will, or its transcript, held the true prize, and someone had been desperate enough to kill for it. Outside, the wind pushed back the curtains and whispered through the eaves, carrying with it a faint scent of bergamot, the scent of gloves left behind, and mysteries yet to unfold. Whimsy exhaled slowly. Tomorrow, he would question the family again. He would check the records once more, and perhaps he would learn not only who wished to bury the past, but who was willing to sit upon it to keep it so. For in this game, time was not merely a measure, but a weapon, and the clock was ticking steadily toward revelation. The morning. Mist clung stubbornly to the Cotswold Hills, casting a silvery haze over the village, as Lord Peter Wimsey arrived at Peveril's Folly once more. The house, with its creeping ivy and weathered stone, seemed to hold its breath, as if anticipating the revelation that now hovered, palpable but elusive, in the air. A quiet but persistent chill suggested that secrets long buried were beginning to stir. Whimsy was met at the door by Inspector Willoughby, whose expression had sharpened overnight with the hunger of a man nearing a breakthrough, yet still encumbered by uncertainty. "I have reviewed the servants' alibis again," he announced, briskly, "and something peculiar has emerged." "Do enlighten me," Whimsy said, allowing a faint smile to soften the edges of his morning solemnity. "Mrs. Ardglass insists she did not enter the library on Monday, yet the carriage clock, located precisely there, was fast by 3 minutes. As you observed, the discrepancy must have been introduced then, and only someone with access to the library and knowledge of the clocks could have tampered with it," Willoughby nodded, "which limits the suspects considerably." "Indeed," Whimsy agreed, "but let us not forget the family's various watches, each set to a different time. A house filled with clocks and timepieces is a house filled with opportunity for misdirection." He paused, tapping ash delicately from his cigar. "We need to establish who had the opportunity to be in the library on that Monday morning. Around the time the letter was delivered, Willoughby pulled out a notebook. "Peters, the chauffeur, claims to have been on the mail run from 8 m. to 9 a.m. alone. The butler was in the kitchen, overseeing breakfast preparations from 7:30 to 9 hands, corroborated by kitchen staff. The cook and maids confirmed this. And Miss Malvern. According to the Spa Museum, she arrived in Cheltenham shortly after 9 and remained there for the day." Whimsy's eyes gleamed. "A solid alibi on the surface. But as always, the devil lurks in details overlooked." They turned their attention to Geoffrey Peveril, the nephew. His alibi had been one of the weakest. The late night. Poker game at the village pub was supported only by a landlord with a fondness for exaggeration and a glass or two too many. "And I have discovered something else," Willoughby said. "Geoffrey's supposed poker game ended abruptly at midnight, but witnesses saw him leave the pub alone at 11:45. Leaving an unaccounted 15 minutes, Wimsey mused. An invitation for mischief. They resolved to interview Geoffrey. Again, but first, Wimsey wished to examine the library with fresh eyes. The room was still as it had been. Heavy bookshelves lined the walls. The carriage clock sat solemnly on the mantel, and the window overlooked the garden where the bench awaited its grim occupant. Wimsey crouched by the clock, inspecting the adjustment screw. A gentle twist to the right would accelerate the pendulum, causing the clock to run fast, he explained. Someone with a careful hand and a knowledge of mechanics, or at least enough patience to experiment. "Do you think the clock was altered deliberately to fabricate an alibi?" "I have no doubt of it." His gaze rose to the window. The window, by the way, was found slightly ajar, as if to allow a fresh breeze, or perhaps to permit an entrance, or exit unnoticed. Willoughby frowned. "No signs of forced entry?" "None that I could find." The latch was old but intact, and the paint on the frame unbroken. Someone familiar with the house, no doubt. "Meaning the culprit is likely one of us, or one of them," Willoughby said, nodding toward the household. That afternoon, Wimsey summoned Geoffrey Peveril to the drawing-room. The young man arrived brash and restless, his eyes darting nervously despite his attempt at nonchalance. "Lord Geoffrey," Wimsey began, "your absence from the pub after 11:45 p.m. on Monday intrigues me." Geoffrey flushed. "I left because I was feeling ill, that's all. Then pray tell, where did you spend those final 15 minutes outside getting some fresh air? And alone?" "Yes." Wimsey studied him carefully. "And yet no witness confirms this, and your poker companions recall you leaving the table promptly at midnight." The young man's jaw tightened. "I suppose they didn't pay attention." "Perhaps," said Wimsey gently. "Or perhaps you prefer it so. Your financial difficulties and the pending will could be reason enough to act." Geoffrey's facade cracked briefly, a flicker of anger and fear passing across his face. "You have no proof?" "Not yet," Wimsey admitted, "but proof often hides in plain sight, waiting for a patient eye." Next, Wimsey sought an interview with Margaret Peveril. She appeared composed but guarded, her social polish masking a certain brittle tension. "Here you were in London last weekend," Wimsey began, "attending an exhibition." "Yes," she replied smoothly, "a welcome distraction." "Alone?" Her eyes narrowed slightly. "I have friends in London who accompanied me." "None to verify your whereabouts during the night in question?" She hesitated, then said, "No, but why would you suspect me?" Merely following the threads, Margaret smiled thinly. "I'm afraid the threads may unravel sooner than you expect." Wimsey noted the challenge, but chose to change tack. "Did you notice anything unusual about your husband's behavior in the days before his death?" Peter was preoccupied. Distant, perhaps, troubled by family matters and the past. "Did he mention the manuscript or the missing will?" She shook her head. "No. But he did receive strange letters." "Unsigned." Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. "Yes." Wimsey filed away the information as he always did, like a jeweler stacking rough gems. Each fact alone was innocuous. Together they formed a pattern. Later, as dusk settled again, Wimsey revisited Miss Malvin's glove. The scent of bergamot, still faint on its leather, was not a common perfume, but neither was it unique. Still, he wondered if there was a significance. Beyond the obvious, he examined the initials embroidered inside. "E.A.M. Eleanor Alice Malvern," he muttered. "A simple signature, or a red herring?" Wimsey was also drawn back to the housekeeper, Mrs. Ardglass. Her stories had gaps, moments where her eyes flickered away when questioned about the library or the family's clocks. He called her once more to the study. "Mrs. Ardglass, you have served this family for many years." "Yes, my lord. Have you ever seen anyone in the library late at night after the household had retired?" Mrs. Ardglass hesitated. "Occasionally Miss Malvern would come here late to collect books or letters, but never anyone else." "And on Monday?" The woman swallowed. "Miss Malvern was not here Monday morning." "Are you sure? Could she?" Have come and gone without being noticed? Mrs. Arglass's eyes narrowed. I think not. We would have heard. Whimsy's gaze sharpened. And yet someone tampered with the carriage clock in that room on Monday morning. Mrs. Arglass's composure slipped for a moment. I cannot say. Indeed. Whimsy allowed the moment to stretch. Sometimes silence is more revealing than words. Before she could respond further, Willoughby interrupted with news from the village. A local fisherman had reported seeing a figure walking briskly near the folly on Monday morning, cloaked and hooded, who vanished when approached. A stranger? Willoughby speculated, or someone who wished to appear as such. Whimsy nodded. The plot thickens, Inspector. We have altered clocks, a scratched car, uncertain alibis, and a figure shrouded in secrecy. He returned to the study window, gazing out toward the chapel and the bench beyond. The seat where the man who sat on a Monday had waited, perhaps for a meeting, perhaps for justice, perhaps for the past to be confronted. The tangled threads of time and truth were drawing tighter, and Whimsy knew the hour approached when masks would fall and the true story would emerge. Not as a ghost story or a Gothic tale, but as a testament to human frailty, obsession, and the unyielding logic of a brilliant mind. Tomorrow, he resolved, would be the day the chronologies were tested, the testimonies challenged, and the shadows dispersed by the precise light of deduction. Whimsy awoke with a start, the early morning light seeping through the curtains of his modest lodgings in Cheltenham, a fine mist still clinging to the narrow streets below. The puzzle of Peveril's folly lay heavily upon him, as it did with the persistent insistence of a particularly vexing sonnet. His mind flickered through the myriad strands of testimony, the barely perceptible shifts in manner, the subtle inconsistencies that had escaped the casual observer. Over breakfast, he reviewed his notes, particularly the curious detail about the window left ajar in the library. It was, in ordinary circumstances, a trivial oversight, but in this case, it might have been the key to understanding the apparent breach of time and place, the subtle manipulation of events that had so far baffled both police and family alike. The window was small, its latch old but functional, and its position gave a direct view of the garden path where the morning mist lingered. If someone had entered or exited thus, they would have had to do so with care and a knowledge of the household's routines. Whimsy's thoughts were interrupted by a knock. Inspector Willoughby entered, hands in pockets, a bundle of official-looking papers tucked under one arm. Good morning, my lord. I've re-examined the sequence of deliveries and movements on Monday. The timeline is quite tighter than it seemed. Ah. The chronology, Whimsy replied with a smile that was more a grimace of respect. The skeleton key of every good mystery. Willoughby handed him the papers, the printed schedules of postal deliveries, servant shifts, and family movements. Peters, the chauffeur, claims he was on the mail run from 8 to 9, yet the post office's record shows the mail was collected and dispatched precisely at 8:10. Peters' timing is possible, but leaves little room for deviation, which suggests, Whimsy said, that any tampering with the clocks or letters had to occur before or after this window. Precisely. Yet none of the servants admit to leaving their posts during this critical hour, which is rather convenient. Convenient or carefully rehearsed? Whimsy tapped his chin thoughtfully. May I ask, did anyone observe the exact time when the letter was delivered to the house? The butler, Mr. Griggs, says it was before breakfast at 8:45. An important point, Whimsy murmured, since the carriage clock in the library was already running fast by 3 minutes at that hour. He rose abruptly, the logic assembling itself with the satisfying precision of a cathedral's rose window. We must re-examine Mr. Griggs' testimony and also consider who had the opportunity to enter the library between mail delivery and breakfast. Willoughby nodded, already making notes. I'll arrange to speak with the butler again. Meanwhile, perhaps you would like to revisit the library. Yes, it never tells the whole story the first time. Whimsy dressed swiftly and they set off for Peveril's Folly. The house was quieter now, the family away or withdrawn, leaving the staff to their subdued tasks. In the library, Whimsy ran a finger lightly over the carriage clock's face. The faint scent of oil and dust mingled with something else, a whisper of tobacco smoke, sharp and lingering. That, Whimsy said, is unusual. None of the family. Smoke in this room. Willoughby glanced about. Could it be the butler? Possible, Wimsey agreed, though I have my suspicions. He moved to the window, gently testing the latch again. No sign of forced entry, but it would take a nimble hand to open and close this without disturbance. Note the lack of scuff marks on the sill. He studied the floorboards near the window, tracing the grain with his eyes. Yet there is a faint indentation here, almost imperceptible. Kneeling, he found a small piece of cloth snagged on a nail. A fragment of fabric, Wimsey said, retrieving it carefully. This may prove useful. He examined the threads under his magnifying glass, coarse wool, dark blue, with a distinctive weave. Not from the household uniforms nor the usual attire of the servants. Willoughby frowned. Could belong to Geoffrey Peveril. His jacket, if I recall, is a similar hue. Indeed, Wimsey said, pocketing the fragment. We shall see. Later that afternoon, Wimsey requested an audience with Geoffrey himself. The young man was less composed than before, a restless energy underpinning his answers. Lord Peter, Geoffrey began, I do not understand why you persist in suspecting me. I had no motive for such a crime. Motives are often buried beneath layers of denial, Geoffrey. Money, jealousy, resentment. Take your pick. Geoffrey's fingers drummed nervously on the armrest. If you must know, I was not near. The library on Monday morning. Wimsey fixed him with a gaze that brooked no evasion. Yet the fragment of fabric found near the window suggests otherwise. Geoffrey paled. I do not know how it got there. Perhaps you exited through the window seeking to avoid detection. I swear I did not. Very well. Wimsey's tone softened. Let us move on. You mentioned financial difficulties. Was there anyone who knew of these? Geoffrey swallowed hard. Only my aunt. She promised to help. Margaret Peveril, Wimsey mused aloud, making a note. Curious how her alibi remains so vague. Geoffrey looked away. She's a difficult woman. Indeed. Wimsey stood, allowing the interview to conclude. Next, he sought out Mrs. Ardglass once more. The housekeeper was reluctant, but the weight of the investigation bore upon her. Mrs. Ardglass, you say you did not see Miss Malvern on Monday morning. The woman's lips thinned. No, my lord. She was away at the spa, and yet her glove was found in the library. Mrs. Ardglass's eyes flickered. She may have dropped it earlier. Perhaps, Wimsey agreed, but would she leave a single glove behind if she intended to be absent? The housekeeper's composure cracked slightly. Miss Malvern had her reasons for secrecy. Indeed, and secrets are often the currency of tragedy. Wimsey's mind returned to the missing will, the unsigned letters, the strange figure seen near the folly. The threads of jealousy, fear, and deceit were woven tightly, yet a single strand remained elusive. Later that evening, as the house settled into an uneasy quiet, Wimsey requested the drawing-room to be cleared and prepared for a gathering. He would reconstruct the events in full, drawing the cast of characters to the stage of his making. The moment was approaching, the testing of timelines, the unveiling of truths. The facade of civility and calm was ready to crack, and beneath it lay the fragile heart of human motive. Wimsey lit a fresh cigar and smiled faintly. Let us see which among them will falter when the clock strikes. The drawing-room at Peveril's Folly was arranged with meticulous care, chairs placed in a semicircle, the flicker of candlelight casting long shadows that danced like spectres along the wallpaper. Wimsey surveyed his small audience with the arch expression of a man about to perform a feat of legerdemain. The family and servants were gathered, each with their own carefully rehearsed alibi and tightly folded denials, and the inspector from Scotland Yard stood off to one side, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. Ladies and gentlemen, Wimsey began, his voice calm but edged with iron, I am grateful for your punctuality on this occasion, though I trust you find the summons as unexpected as I do the circumstances that have brought us together. A faint murmur rippled through the assembled company. Lady Margaret gave a slight, imperceptible tightening of her lips. Geoffrey shifted uneasily in his chair, and Mr. Griggs, the butler, maintained a posture as rigid as the mahogany furniture. Now, it has been said with some justice that the truth has a habit of hiding in plain sight. It waits patiently while we chase shadows and speculate wildly, only to reveal itself when the proper light is cast upon it. Tonight, I intend to cast such a light." Whimsy turned to the grandfather clock in the corner, its pendulum swinging, with a deliberate hypnotic rhythm. Time, as you will appreciate, is a rather ruthless judge of events. The minutest inconsistency in timing can unravel a carefully constructed deception. I shall demonstrate this presently. He moved to the center of the room and drew from his pocket the small fragment of fabric found near the library window. Holding it up to the candlelight, he let the texture and color speak their silent testimony. "This cloth, gentlemen, belongs to a garment most particular in weave and hue. It matches precisely the jacket worn by our young Mr. Geoffrey Peveril, whose movements on the morning of Monday, the 21st, warrant closer scrutiny." Geoffrey's face hardened. "I have told you, Lord Peter, I was nowhere near the library window that morning." "Quite so. Yet the fragment was found on the windowsill where only one person could have brushed it against the nail projecting there. Let us consider the timeline." Whimsy beckoned the butler forward. "Mr. Griggs, you testified that you delivered the mail shortly before breakfast, correct?" "Yes, my lord," the butler replied, voice steady. "And you saw the letter addressed to Mr. Peveril on the desk in the library at that time?" "That is correct, my lord." "Excellent. And the carriage clock, I believe, was already 3 minutes fast when you delivered the letter." Griggs glanced at the clock, then nodded. "Indeed, my lord. Curious, is it not, that a clock would run fast by a consistent margin, and yet none of you noticed until after the events in question?" Whimsy's eyes glinted. "A clock running? Fast is a clock telling a lie. And lies, dear friends, are the currency of this investigation." He paused to let the weight of his words settle. "Now, let us reconstruct the morning. The mail arrives promptly at 8:10, as the post office records. Attest. The butler places the letter on the library desk at approximately 8:45, according to his testimony. Breakfast is served shortly thereafter. Whimsy turned to Geoffrey. "Where were you between 8:30 and 9, young man?" Geoffrey's voice faltered. "I was in the stables preparing the horses for the trip to Cheltenham later that day." "Precisely." Whimsy nodded, as if confirming a point he already knew. "And you, Mr. Griggs?" "In the pantry, my lord." "And Lady Margaret?" "In her sitting room, preparing correspondence." "Very well, let us address the peculiar case of the open window." Whimsy moved to the window, lifting the sash slowly. The window was ajar at the time of the incident, yet no one admits to opening it. Strange, considering the chill of the morning air. He gestured to the group. "Would any of you care to explain?" A pregnant silence followed. Lady Margaret's fingers tightened around the armrest, and Geoffrey avoided Whimsy's gaze. Whimsy turned to Inspector Willoughby. "You were present at the library earlier that day?" "I was, my lord." "And you did not notice the window open? Not until later in the afternoon, after the body was discovered?" "Exactly." Whimsy smiled faintly. "Which raises the question, who opened the window and why?" He circled back to the butler. "Mr. Griggs, you alone had the access and knowledge to do so without drawing attention." The butler's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. "Yet it was not you," Whimsy continued, "because you were elsewhere. At the crucial moment." He looked pointedly at Geoffrey. "Nor you. Then we are left with but one other candidate." Eyes flicked around the room, unease spreading like a chill wind. "Miss Malvern," Whimsy said softly. A sharp intake of breath was audible. "Miss Malvern, your glove was found in the library. You claim to be away at the spa, yet the timeline and your belongings contradict this. Pray, how do you explain your presence at Peveril's Folly on that morning?" Miss Malvern's composure broke. I went there, yes, but only to speak with Mr. Peveril." "To discuss what, may I ask?" She hesitated, then said, "Matters of the will." Whimsy raised an eyebrow. "Aha. And did you know that the original will was missing when Mr. Peveril died?" "Yes," she admitted. "I feared something was amiss." "Your concern was well-founded, it would seem." He returned to the clock. "Now, the key to understanding this mystery lies not only in who was present, but who manipulated time itself. The carriage clock, the hall clock, the kitchen clock, they do not tell the same hour." "The hall clock," Lady Margaret interjected. "I thought all the clocks were synchronized." "Ah, but they were not," Whimsy said. "Someone has tampered with the timepieces, to create confusion and mislead the investigation. He fixed his gaze on Geoffrey. Who stood to gain by such deception? The young man paled visibly. I do not understand. Indeed you do. The missing will, the altered clocks, the open window, they are pieces of a carefully orchestrated design. Whimsy turned to the assembled company. This design, while intricate, is not beyond unraveling. For the human mind, when subjected to the rigors of logic, must eventually yield its secrets. He paused. The room hushed in anticipation. Tomorrow, we shall begin the reenactment. I shall ask each of you to demonstrate your movements precisely. As they occurred on that fateful Monday, a murmur rippled through the room. Geoffrey's jaw tightened. Lady Margaret's gaze was steady but cold. Until then, Whimsy concluded, I recommend rest and reflection. For the truth, like the dawn, waits patiently beyond the shadows of night. As the company dispersed, Whimsy lingered by the window, the scent of tobacco smoke still faint in the air. His mind churned, timelines, motives, and masks all converging toward revelation. The theatre was set. The players, though unaware, were bound by the invisible script he was about to unfold. The morning sun struggled through heavy curtains as the household of Peveril's Folly stirred uneasily to meet the day that would, in all probability, unravel their carefully maintained facades. Lord Peter Wimsey, punctual as ever, awaited the arrival of his reluctant cast with a patience that masked a keen anticipation. The assembled group entered the drawing-room with an awkward formality, each acutely aware that their movements were now under the scrutinizing eye of a man who regarded human nature as an elaborate chess game, one where every pawn's tremble betrayed a hidden stratagem. Whimsy began with a light, almost dismissive tone, though his eyes were bright with unyielding focus. We shall now embark upon a modest theatrical enterprise, the reenactment of the morning of Monday, the 21st of May, as it transpired within these venerable walls. He gestured to the large clock whose pendulum swung steadily in the corner. The stage is set, the props arranged. We ask only your candor and precision in this humble performance. The butler, Mr. Griggs, cleared his throat and took his place near the pantry door. Lady Margaret seated herself stiffly by the window, while Geoffrey lingered uncertainly by the hearth. Miss Malvern, a pale figure still marked by the residual tension of the previous evening, settled into a chair beside the heavy velvet drapes. Inspector Willoughby, notebook at the ready, surveyed the scene with a mixture of skepticism and intrigue. Let us begin with the first pivotal moment, Annette. Arrival of the mail, Whimsy said, directing his attention toward Mr. Griggs. You stated that you delivered the letters before breakfast. Precisely what time was that? Griggs glanced at his watch. Approximately 8:45 a.m., my lord. Thank you. And did you observe anything unusual at that time? The butler hesitated, then replied carefully, No, sir. All was as expected. Very well. Now, if you would accompany me to the library, Mr. Griggs. The butler followed Whimsy with the composed deference born of years of service. In the library, Whimsy pointed to the open window. Here, gentlemen, is the curious aperture we discussed. Mr. Griggs, might you demonstrate how one would open and close this window? With a deft motion, the butler lifted the sash, revealing the garden path below. The action was smooth, practiced. Note the lack of disturbance, Whimsy remarked, crouching to examine the sill and floorboards. And yet, a fragment of blue fabric was found snagged upon a nail here. It seems someone brushed against the window frame in haste or with less care than Mr. Griggs just demonstrated. He rose and turned to Geoffrey. Would you care to explain? Mr. Peveril? Geoffrey's face flushed. I told you I was in the stables. Indeed, Whimsy conceded. However, your jacket bears a similar fabric to that which was found on the window. Coincidence or consequence? The young man swallowed hard. I must have brushed past the window at some point, but not during the crucial hour. Curious. How memories fragment under pressure, Whimsy observed lightly. Now let us reconstruct the timeline more precisely. He took a step back and faced the group. At 8:10, the post office dispatched the mail, confirmed by official records. At 8:45, the letters arrived at Peveril's Folly. Shortly after, breakfast was served. Lady Margaret, where were you during this interval? Lady Margaret's gaze was steady, almost imperious. "In my sitting room, attending to correspondence. An excellent alibi," Wimsey said, "if only corroborated." The inspector nodded. "The maid, Miss Evans, confirms seeing Lady Margaret at her writing desk during that time." "And you, Miss Malvern?" Wimsey asked gently. "I was at the spa," she replied, though the earlier glove found in the library suggested otherwise. Wimsey smiled faintly. "Your presence here, then, is a matter for further consideration." He moved to the grand hall clock. "Now, gentlemen, you will observe the disparity among the clocks. This hall clock runs 2 minutes slow. The library carriage clock runs 3 minutes fast. The kitchen clock is accurate to the minute, which implies," Wimsey explained, "that one or more of these clocks were deliberately set to confuse and mislead." The room was silent, save for the steady ticking. "Who among you would benefit from such confusion?" Wimsey asked, looking pointedly at Geoffrey. The young man shifted uneasily. I suppose the confusion would make it easier to conceal certain movements." "Indeed." Wimsey's eyes sparkled with the light of revelation. "Consider the implications. If the library clock was running fast, a letter seemingly delivered at 8:45 might have actually arrived earlier or later, depending on which clock you trust." Wimsey paced thoughtfully. "Let us examine the kitchen staff's testimony. Miss Evans, would you demonstrate your movements during the crucial hour?" The maid stepped forward, outlining her path through the kitchen and pantry. "I was in the kitchen from 8:30 until breakfast was served at 9 Gassé. Did you hear anything unusual?" Wimsey inquired. "No, my lord, nothing out of the ordinary." Wimsey nodded. "Yet the body was discovered some hours later. The silence of the kitchen suggests the crime took place elsewhere, precisely where remains to be determined." He then turned to Inspector Willoughby. "Have you tested the soundproofing of the library door?" "Yes, my lord. It is solid oak, but not impervious to noise." "Then it would be difficult to conceal a violent act without alerting the household," Wimsey mused. His gaze lingered on Lady Margaret. "Unless the household was deliberately distracted." "Distracted?" Lady Margaret asked, suspicion creeping into her tone. "A faint ringing bell," Wimsey explained, "heard from the servants' quarters. It was noted at 8:50, just before the supposed time of the incident." "Ah, the bell," Geoffrey said suddenly. "I rang it to summon the stable hand." Wimsey raised an eyebrow. "An act of innocent convenience or a convenient alibi?" The group was restless now, the atmosphere taut as a drawn bowstring. Wimsey turned back to the library window. "One final piece of evidence," he said, holding up a small, delicate locket. "Found near the garden path. It bears the initials MP," Lady Margaret gasped softly. "Yet," Wimsey continued, "it was not in her possession when we searched her room." "The locket belonged to my mother," Lady Margaret said quietly. "I lost it months ago." "Or was it placed deliberately?" Wimsey asked. He let the question hang as the clock chimed 10. The investigation had drawn back its curtain on the intricate dance of deceit. The characters were exposed, their secrets now palpable, their alibis frayed. Wimsey extinguished his cigar and smiled thinly. "Tomorrow's sun will bring further clarity. Tonight we have measured the first beats of the mystery's heart. Rest well, for the game is far from over." The evening had settled heavily upon Peveril's Folly, its shadows pooling in the corners of the great house like secretive whispers. The occupants, now retreating from the oppressive formality of the day's reenactment, dispersed into their private quarters, each accompanied by a mixture of apprehension and weary calculation. Lord Peter Wimsey lingered alone in the library, the faint glow of a shaded lamp casting an intimate circle of light around his slender figure as he contemplated the maze of contradictions he had unearthed. His fingers traced absently along the spine of a leather-bound volume, but his mind was far from literary pursuits. The locket bearing the initials MP, Lady Margaret's missing keepsake, had taken root in his thoughts. It was a token of affection, and yet its presence, near the garden window where the fragment of blue fabric was found, suggested a deliberate message, or perhaps a staged clue. The question gnawed at him. Who had the most to gain by implicating Lady Margaret, or by diverting suspicion onto her? The mechanical ticking of the clocks in the hall echoed softly in the silence, a metronome to the quiet tension. The discrepancy, among them, one slow, another fast, and a third accurate, still struck a discordant note in the carefully constructed timeline. Wimsey found himself returning to that incongruity, suspecting the temporal confusion was not accidental, but a meticulously woven ruse. As the clock chimed the hour, a soft knock interrupted his reverie. It was Miss Malvern, pale and composed, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of nervousness. She entered silently, closing the door behind her, and seated herself with the grace of one accustomed to concealing more than she revealed. "Lord Peter," she began, "I trust you will forgive my intrusion at this late hour." "On the contrary." "Miss Malvern," Wimsey replied with a faint smile, "your timing is impeccable. Pray, what weighs upon your mind?" She hesitated before speaking. "The morning's events have been troubling, to say the least. I fear there are elements we have overlooked, perhaps beneath the surface of what appears." Wimsey inclined his head. "Pray, elaborate." She drew a slender handkerchief from her sleeve, twisting it nervously. "You mentioned the servant's bell ringing at 8:50 a.m. I cannot help but recall that at precisely that time I had left the spa and was walking through the garden towards the main house. I did not see anyone, yet I heard a muffled noise, like a suppressed argument, emanating from the library window." "An intriguing detail," Wimsey murmured. "We have thus an auditory witness, albeit indirect, to something amiss within that chamber at the very moment the timeline grows most tangled." Miss Malvern nodded. "Yes, and it struck me as peculiar that no one else has mentioned this noise. It was brief but urgent. I dare say it was deliberately silenced." Wimsey's fingers drummed lightly on the arm of his chair. "Silenced, indeed. The solidity of the library door and the thickness of the drapes would have muffled sound, yet not entirely prevented it. Whoever was inside must have known this well." He stood and moved to the window, drawing aside the curtain to survey the shadowed garden. If the victim struggled or spoke, it would have been near impossible to escape notice, unless the household was intentionally distracted. "The bell, the clocks," Miss Malvern said quietly, as if fitting pieces into a puzzle only half understood. "Exactly," Wimsey agreed. "And the bell summons the servants away, fracturing their attention at a crucial juncture. The clocks confuse the timeline, creating a false alibi." He turned sharply. "Tell me, Miss Malvern, have you observed any unusual behavior among the household staff recently?" She considered for a moment. "Mr. Griggs has been more reserved than usual, and the stable hand Tom seems unnervingly eager to avoid conversation." "Tom, you say?" Wimsey tapped his chin thoughtfully. "I have yet to question him thoroughly." Before he could continue, a discreet knock announced the arrival of Inspector Willoughby. The inspector entered, his expression grave but alert. "Lord Peter, a development," he said. "We've located the whereabouts of the missing gloves found in the library." "Excellent," Wimsey said briskly. "Do tell." Willoughby produced a small leather case. They were discovered in the garden, hid behind the stables, carefully placed inside the glove compartment of a discarded carriage trunk. "It appears they were hidden deliberately." "Curious," Wimsey murmured. "The glove in the library was pale, correct?" "Yes. Miss Malvern's glove, according to her maid." Wimsey's gaze sharpened. "Then it follows that someone sought to incriminate her, or at least to misdirect suspicion." The inspector nodded. "Indeed. The carriage trunk itself bears signs of recent disturbance, as though rifled through hastily." "Who has had access to the stables and shed?" Wimsey asked. "Tom, the stable hand, and occasionally Geoffrey Peveril." Wimsey's eyes flickered. "We must speak with Tom at once. The time is ripe to unsettle the assumptions we have so far accepted." The group moved swiftly to the stables, where the scent of hay and leather hung heavy in the air. Tom, a broad-shouldered youth with a nervous manner, was found polishing horseshoes. His face blanched at the sight of the inspector and Lord Peter. "Tom," Wimsey began gently, "might you tell us your movements on the morning of the 21st? The young man swallowed. "I was in the stable-yard from dawn until the midday. Feed. Didn't leave. Yet the gloves were found in your domain," the inspector pointed out. Tom's eyes darted. "I don't know how they got there, sir, I swear it." "Did you see anyone else near the shed that morning?" Wimsey pressed. "No one," Tom replied, though his voice wavered. Wimsey exchanged a glance with the inspector. "It seems, Tom, you are caught between loyalty and honesty, but the truth will serve you better in the long run." The stable hand's shoulders sagged. "There was someone," he confessed reluctantly. "Geoffrey Peveril. I saw him near the shed around 8:30. "Thank you, Tom," Whimsy said kindly. "That will do for now." Outside, the wind stirred the branches overhead, casting flickering shadows. Whimsy's mind raced through the implications. Geoffrey's proximity to the shed and the library window placed him at the heart of the puzzle. The fragment of fabric, the hidden gloves, the confusing clocks, all hinted at an orchestrated attempt to manipulate the narrative. Back inside, Whimsy convened the household once more. His expression was as unreadable as ever, but the glint in his eye bespoke the gathering storm of revelation. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "we are now poised to reconsider what we have long accepted as truth. The timeline, the alibis, the evidence. Each is a strand in a web woven to ensnare the innocent and protect the guilty." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle. The gloves hidden in the stables, the fragment of fabric caught upon the library window, the deliberate missetting of clocks. These are not isolated acts of chance, but calculated moves made to obscure the true sequence of events and to cast suspicion where it does not belong. His gaze fell upon Geoffrey. "You, Mr. Peveril, have been at the center of this design. Your movements contradict your statements, and your access to the critical locations is undeniable." Geoffrey's face drained of color. "You have no proof, nothing but circumstantial evidence." Whimsy smiled thinly. "Proof often hides beneath layers of circumstance, waiting for the patient eye to discern it." He turned to Lady Margaret. "The locket, dear lady, was it truly misplaced, or did you seek to conceal it?" Lady Margaret's composure faltered for a moment. I thought I had lost it. I did not know it was here." "And yet," Whimsy pressed, "it was found close to the scene of the crime, near the window through which your garments were brushed." The room was taut with tension. Inspector Willoughby stepped forward. "Lord Peter, shall we proceed with a formal search of Mr. Peveril's quarters?" Whimsy inclined his head. "Pray do." The search uncovered a bundle of correspondence beneath Geoffrey's mattress, letters marked with urgency and distress, financial demands, threats veiled in polite language, a desperate attempt to conceal debts that might ruin him. Whimsy produced one letter. Here a demand for money and here a refusal wrapped in menace. The motive grows clearer still. Geoffrey's shoulders slumped. The carefully constructed mask was cracking. "Now," Whimsy said quietly, "let us reconstruct the morning, once more with this newfound truth to guide us." He detailed how Geoffrey, desperate to conceal his debts and to silence any interference, had manipulated the clocks, rung the bell to disperse the staff, and staged the glove and locket to misdirect suspicion upon others. The murder, a moment of rage and fear, was concealed behind a curtain of temporal confusion and calculated distractions. As the full chain of deduction unfolded, the guilty man's resistance wavered, and the weight of logic pressed inexorably upon his conscience. In the final moments, as the house held its breath, Geoffrey faltered, a last bitter irony escaping his lips. "I sat on Monday to catch time, but time caught me instead." Whimsy allowed himself a small smile, the gleam of triumph tempered by the somber reality of human frailty. "Indeed, Mr. Peveril, time is the most exacting of judges." The household exhaled collectively, the spell broken. As dawn edged the horizon, Lord Peter Whimsy took his leave with a parting quip to Inspector Willoughby. "Justice, like a good cigar, requires patience and the right touch. One must not rush to ashes too soon." With that, the great house fell silent once more, the mysteries laid bare beneath the merciless light of reason and wit. The library was silent, but for the faint, steady ticking of the grandfather clock. No longer a jarring cacophony, but a measured heartbeat marking the passage of truth. Lord Peter Whimsy stood at the hearth, hands lightly clasped behind his back, as the assembled household awaited his final exposition. Their faces wore masks of anxiety, curiosity, and in some cases, weary resignation. "My friends," Whimsy began, his voice calm, carrying the weight of certainty beneath its cultivated lightness, "we have journeyed through tangled webs of half-truths and deliberate distractions. The labyrinth of clocks, bells, misplaced gloves, and the curious matter of the fragment of fabric have all been threads in a far more intricate tapestry than first perceived. He paused, letting his gaze settle briefly on Lady Margaret, whose pale composure seemed to falter, as if sensing the fulcrum of revelation. Let us return to the earliest moment of discord. The servant's bell rung at 8:50 a.m. was not, as presumed, a call for assistance or routine. No, it was a signal, orchestrated with meticulous care, to scatter attention, to fragment the household's vigilance, and to provide an unobserved window for the perpetrator. He moved with a slight elegance to the window, drawing aside the curtain once more to reveal the garden beyond, quiet and unassuming in the morning light. The fragment of blue fabric caught on the library window is no accident. It is the residue of a struggle, yes, but also the clever planting of evidence. The victim's own garments could not have been disturbed in such a manner unless forcibly engaged with another. The question then was, who was there, and why? Whimsy turned, steepling his fingers. We discovered that Geoffrey Peveril's debts were no secret to those attentive enough, and his financial desperation provided a motive. Yet motive alone is but a whisper in the halls of justice. Action is required. He motioned to Inspector Willoughby, who produced the letters found hidden beneath Geoffrey's mattress. Pleas for money, veiled threats, and warnings of ruin. It is clear Mr. Peveril sought to hide his desperation, and in doing so created a facade of innocence that nearly held firm. But, Whimsy continued, there are two crucial observations which unravel this illusion. Firstly, the clocks, each deliberately altered to create confusion, yet one clock remained steadfast, an outlier that recorded the true time. The bell rang to scatter witnesses. The gloves hidden in the stable shed were planted to implicate Miss Malvern, an innocent party. And secondly, he said, voice dropping to an intimate cadence, the testimony of the stable hand Tom who saw Geoffrey in proximity to the stables at the critical time. Geoffrey's own movements contradict his claims. The alibi is a brittle shell. Whimsy paced slowly before the expectant faces. The murder was a moment of tragic desperation, an act born of fear rather than malice. The victim confronted Geoffrey about his debts, perhaps threatening exposure. The ensuing quarrel escalated beyond reason, and in a brief dark interval life was cruelly extinguished. Geoffrey's eyes flickered, a cocktail of defiance and despair. The silence thickened before he finally broke, voice low and trembling. "You have me, then." "A confession of sorts," Whimsy acknowledged with a nod, "though it is the weaving of logic, not confession, that has guided us here." He stepped forward, producing the missing locket. Lady Margaret's keepsake was deliberately placed near the scene to misdirect. The perpetrator hoped that such sentimental tokens would obscure the cold calculus of evidence. Lady Margaret's lips parted in a faint gasp, but no denial came. Whimsy's gaze swept the room one last time. Justice is a precise instrument, and today it has been wielded with care. May this resolution remind us that beneath the polished veneer of society lie human frailties, fear, pride, and desperation that compel even the most unthinkable acts. With an ironic smile, he added, "As Shakespeare might say, the evil that men do lives after them. The good is oft interred with their bones. Yet here the good, or at least the truth, refuses burial." Inspector Willoughby stepped forward to take Geoffrey into custody, while the household absorbed the revelation with a mix of relief and somber contemplation. Whimsy turned to depart, his hand lightly resting on the library door. "Remember, justice is a game best played with patience, observation, and a well-lit cigar." He cast a final glance over his shoulder, and with a mind unclouded by sentiment or superstition, as he disappeared into the gathering dusk, the house exhaled, the shadows retreating from the corners where secrets had once thrived. The clocks resumed their steady, honest ticking, time restored to its rightful order, and truth, at last, seated firmly in its place.